Thursday. Joining me now is Democratic Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett from Texas. She's a member of both the House Agriculture and House Oversight and Accountability Committees. Congresswoman Crockett, thank you for being with us. I don't know. I'm not smart enough to know, and I'm not a decision maker. I'm a voter like everybody else. I'm not sure what the right thing to do is about that debate. I am sure that a bad debate performance by an 80-year-old guy who's given a lot of time to this country, who's not convicted of anything, who generally is not thought of as a person who lies. I've not heard anybody say that about it, who is a compassionate, empathetic being in the face of an opposition of Donald Trump is a no-brainer. So everybody needs to slow their roll for a minute while we think about what the next steps are.
Yeah, you know, it is so wild to me, and it's been quite annoying, if I'm going to be perfectly honest, that Democrats get into a frenzy. I mean, it's almost like we're scared of our shadow sometimes, right? And I think it's because we understand the stakes, and everybody's saying we've got to have the best of the best. And let me tell you something, there is no better heart, there is no better man. And honestly, when it comes down to being an orator, that's never been who Joe Biden has been. I mean, I think that Obama kind of maybe hurt us in a little bit, and Lord knows I love him. But we got used to this amazing orator. And then you've got Trump. He's not an amazing orator whatsoever, but he knows how to just keep talking. And he'll say anything. You know, one of the things that was so frustrating to me when I saw this debate in Atlanta was this fool tried to take credit for insulin prices. And I was like, that was the perfect opportunity to be like, and y'all call me now. He obviously is senile because he is now trying to take credit for my legislation. I would have double dog dared him to tell me what bill that came out of. So, you know, I'm just like, dude, like this guy is crazy. He's evil. And then when I listened to the segment before and you're talking about really issues as it relates to Project 2025, because they do want to install loyalists. They don't want those government workers like my mama, who has always worked for the federal government so long as I can remember, the people that have the institutional knowledge to make sure that they can carry our country forward, and they work under whichever administration, Democratic or Republican. They don't swear their loyalty to an orange Jesus. Instead, they swear their loyalty to the people of this country and our Constitution. And that is the problem that we're running into. So I don't really care if he was off for 90 minutes and didn't put on like people wanted him to put on. The reality is that he is 50,000 times better than Trump, and Republicans will not leave Trump. And he has 34 felony convictions and still got over 50 pending.
So you make an interesting point. Joe Biden's never been a masterful orator, and he's never actually been a particularly strong debater. It's just not his strength. That said, Donald Trump is a remarkably useful idiot for the far right and Project 2025. Project 2025 has found the guy that the Heritage Foundation and the super conservative establishment in this country has found their tool. If he gets elected, because he generally speaking doesn't read policy, certainly doesn't write policy, so they've given him the policy. Here's the problem that a lot of people have identified who are not they're not pearl-clutching about this, is that what's the best way to move forward and defeat Donald Trump in the next election? And how do you convince voters who became very skeptical on Thursday night that this is still the path forward?
Yeah, here's the reality. I mean, we have two choices. It is very clear. You can either go with Donald Trump, who gave us a Supreme Court that is continuing to do harm, who absolutely plans to put additional Supreme Court justices on the bench, as well as install other idiotic judges such as Eileen Cannon, such as Kaczmarek down in Texas, who handled the mifepristone case. Like, if that's the America that you want, then absolutely go vote for Donald Trump. But if you want an America in which repro is a reality, if you want an America where you can love whoever you want to love, that is going to be Joe Biden's America. And let's talk about the fact that this fool wanted to tell us about black jobs, right? Like, let's be clear. Donald Trump does not understand black culture. What he's doing is playing in our faces, and he's got people that he wants to sit up there and throw out as little tokens and be like, hey, look at my black friend. That's essentially what he does. But at the end of the day, I need people to choose themselves. If everybody is saying that the economy is number one, then please tell me why you would vote for Donald Trump when he refused to answer any economic question. He has no plan. He never has had a plan. And the only plan that he plans to follow is the manifesto that's been laid out in Project 2025 that believes that DEI is the end of us. So that means that people like me, people of color, women, that's a problem for them. They want to excommunicate us. Like, they are trying to give the keys over to the white supremacists, as we also saw the Supreme Court do earlier this week as it relates to the insurrectionists. Like, I need people to wake up. I know that they say that they don't want us to be woke, and this is exactly why. Because they want us to be asleep while they continue to take our rights, while they continue to reform our courts, while they continue to say that we don't want you to have access to the ballot box. This is about all of us. So if people want to be honest with themselves, what they need to do is look at which team delivers for you. If you are happy about the dollars that are flowing into your community because of the infrastructure, because of the CHIPS and Science bill, because of the reduction in the cost of insulin that was due to the Democrats, House Democrats, Senate Democrats, and this Democratic administration. It is time to choose yourself and figure out which team is riding with you. If you want more of the chaos that we have seen out of this House, that's all you're going to get times 3 if you decide to go with Donald Trump, because he's loud and wrong.
Democratic Representative Jasmine Crockett bringing it this morning. Thank you for being with us as always. We always appreciate the time that you take for us. Another hour of Velshi starts right now. Joining me now is the Democratic Congressman Jamie Raskin of Maryland. He's the ranking member on the Oversight and Accountability Committee. He previously served as the lead impeachment manager for the second impeachment of Donald Trump. He's a member, or he was a member of the January 6th committee. He's also the author of the book Unthinkable Trauma, Unthinkable Trauma, Truth, and the Trials of American Democracy. Congressman, it is good to have you here, and I don't really know which one to start with because we have two major issues on our hands. So let me just start with the one that John Allen was talking about. The discussions around the future of the Democratic Party with Joe Biden as the presidential candidate. You are a thinker. Our viewers respect you as such. Tell me your thinking.
Well, I mean, this is what a real political party looks like, and this is what a real political party does. But obviously, there was a big problem with Joe Biden's debate performance, and there's also just a tremendous reservoir of affection and love for Joe Biden in our party. And so this makes it a difficult situation for everybody, but there are very honest and serious and rigorous conversations taking place at every level of our party because it is a political party and we have differences of point of view. I mean, if you compare that to the non-existent dialogue and conversation that took place in the Republican Party after Donald Trump's criminal conviction on 34 counts, it's remarkable. And so we're having a serious conversation about what to do. One thing I can tell you is that regardless of what President Biden decides, our party is going to be unified, and our party also needs him at the very center of our deliberations and our campaign. And so whether he's the candidate or someone else is the candidate, he is going to be the keynote speaker at our convention. He will be the figure that we rally around to move forward and beat the forces of authoritarianism and reaction in the country.
All right, let's move on to the thing in which you are also an expert, constitutional law. We are expecting within 24 hours we will get a decision. It's a very unusual because we could have had this decision from the Supreme Court and this opinion a long time ago about Donald Trump's immunity. Very interesting conversation that I had an hour ago with Judge Michael Luttig and with Lawrence Tribe. I want to just play something that Judge Luttig said, because the conversation goes around the fact that even if Donald Trump is not given immunity, it's too late to hold a trial. I put that to Judge Luttig. Here's what he said.
I would urge Jack Smith in the strongest possible terms today not to yield to that cynical partisan politics and to bring this case on for trial even in September or October.
Wow.
In the name of and for the sake of American democracy, the Constitution, and the rule of law.
I would love your take on that. He's saying Jack Smith should go ahead with this if he is at all permitted to by the Supreme Court tomorrow.
Well, I think that in deference to Jack Smith and the executive branch, we've got to let them make their own decisions the way the Supreme Court did not, the way that the majority on the court repeatedly interfered and threw monkey wrenches in that process. I'm smiling only because Judge Luttig, of course, was an extremely conservative Republican judge. And what I'm hearing from a lot of people in this situation, essentially refugees and exiles from Trump land, like Judge Luttig or Liz Cheney or Michael Cohen, these people who are now distinguished patriots standing up for democracy, is they are the people fighting hardest to try to turn things around and make sure that Trump and the forces of MAGA don't run roughshod over our constitutional democracy and everything we believe in. Judge Luttig, I suppose as a professional hazard, places perhaps a little bit more stock in everything that goes on in the courts than I do. I mean, I am not now either in the prognostication business about what courts will do or the adjudication business. I am in the political mobilization business. And for me, this campaign is all about galvanizing millions and millions of people across the country, including disenchanted, renegade Republicans and independents, to come and join the forces of democracy. And that's what's going to save us, not any particular courtroom in the land.
So then that's full circle to our first question about what happens with Joe Biden, because there are lots of sound arguments, and I fully subscribe to them, that 90 minutes does not a presidency make, and that there's no comparison between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. But there is this issue, if you are talking about being somebody who wants to win this election, that there are 100 million eligible voters who sat out the last election. There is a lot of disenchantment amongst voters right now. Thursday may have contributed to yet more of that. What's the best way for Democrats or people who are concerned, whether it's Liz Cheney, Judge Luttig, you, or every other Democrat in this country, to make sure that Donald Trump's not the president of the United States? And I ask you this again to say you didn't rule out the possibility that Joe Biden steps out of the race. What do you think the right thing to do is?
Well, look, we've got a lot of confidence and a lot of faith in President Biden. And, he will have to make the decision about whether or not what happened at the debate was one bad night. And President Obama had one bad night, you remember, in debating Mitt Romney. Yep. Or is it reflective of something else going on? Now, he came back roaring in North Carolina. I thought that was a very sharp and hard-hitting speech when he was in North Carolina. And so that gave me some comfort. But I know that there are still a lot of concerns out there. And those are not concerns that are ill-motivated in any way. Again, we love Joe Biden. He's been a magnificent president. I mean, if you think about the infrastructure plan with, $1.5 trillion investment in the bridges and roads and highways and rural broadband, you think about Inflation Reduction Act and dramatic reductions in prescription drug prices in the Medicare program. I had constituents spending $500 a month on their insulin shots as diabetics. Now that's down to $35. So he's done extraordinary stuff. But the question now is, can we recover from the hit that we took during that debate? And there's, real soul searching going on. But ultimately, President Biden is going to have to make that call. He's the one who's got the supermajority of delegates. The party and the convention are still behind him, but he's going to have to make that judgment. And again, this is what a real political party looks like. It is not a cult of authoritarian personality where one person calls all the shots. And so it's President Biden, it's his advisors, it's governors, it's mayors, it's representatives, it's senators, it's the family, it's America that's involved in this decision. President Biden has never said to America, I alone can do this. I alone will make all the decisions for you. That is the path of dictatorship, and we know who's on that path.
And so your argument, which I think is intriguing, is that this moment that the Democratic Party is going through, or anybody who actually likes democracy in this country is going through, this angst is healthy. It's not a cult. It's not that everybody's got unified messaging on this. And I'm sort of with you on this. Jamie Raskin, good to see you as always. Democratic Representative Jamie Raskin of Maryland. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. And, you know, and I think all of us, regardless of what happens with this particular imbroglio, all of us need to be engaged in this election. And that's what democracy is all about.
Joining me now is the former Democratic Senator Doug Jones of Alabama. He's also a former United States Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama and the author of the book Bending Toward Justice. Ruth Ben-Ghiat is a professor of history at NYU, the author of the Lucid newsletter Following Threats to Democracy, and the author of the book Strongmen, Mussolini to the President. Good morning to both of you. Ruth, you had a very quick response on social media to the debate, and a reminder that some of us forget, and that is that the ensuing discussion about the debate plays very well into Donald Trump's hands and what you call the authoritarian playbook. Tell me more about what you meant.
So this wasn't a debate in the sense that a debate is when two candidates show up to educate the people with accurate information about their agendas so that voters can make a choice. Donald Trump showed up to spew propaganda, turn this into a propaganda show, and that was his information warfare agenda all along. And the problem is, because there was no live fact-checking, which was a grievous error on the part of CNN, whoever was there, it could be, you could substitute Biden for somebody you like better. That person would have been forced into a defensive position, refuting all of the lies, because this was a fire hose of falsehood, as we say in propaganda studies, coming from Trump, and thus would have had to spend his time in defensive position rather than arguing about his case to the American people and focusing on his achievements. So the whole framing of the quote debate is wrong, and it doesn't. We can't have this. Is like the old forms of election politics are continuing, but when you have an authoritarian in the mix, they don't work anymore.
Senator, you know from experience what it's like to run against a volatile, intellectually dishonest, populist candidate. Let's talk about how you. And I take Ruth's point, but for the moment, until we have a better word, we'll refer to it as the debate. How difficult it is to go up against an unrestrained candidate who constantly lies, because that's right. I think it's a moderator's job to try and keep honesty in the debate, but that's very difficult when you run against somebody like Donald Trump.
Yeah, it's almost impossible because they are dominating and controlling. And when you are against an opponent who is completely untethered to the truth, then they can say and do anything and can really be bullying and dominating. And I think about the only thing you could do is just simply look over there and say, that's a damn lie. That is a lie once again. Let me tell you about the Biden administration or whatever. But the fact of the matter is, Allie, and I think you said it in your opening monologue very, very well, the presidency is about much more than a single debate. It is about much more than simply a 2-minute answer on a debate stage or a 1-minute response. It's about judgment. It's about character. It's about deliberation. It's about putting a team, as you noted, an administration together that people have confidence in, and not a bunch of wackos like we have seen in the past with Donald Trump and more likely to see again. That's what this is about. And I think going forward, people are going to see that. Yeah, you're going to see Joe Biden's debate performance over and over again. But I think as we go forward, you're going to see a lot coming out about what Donald Trump actually said and did. And it is somewhat frightening for the American people when the Republican Party, unlike Democrats, who are openly talking about the fact that Biden had a bad night. That's the way democracy works. On the other hand, as you noted, you got a Republican Party who is falling in line behind their dear leader, who will not question the 34 felony counts, will not question his millions of dollars in fraud judgments, which means misleading the public in fraud. Nobody is questioning that. And I think as we go forward, that is going to become crystal clear to the American people.
And that is an interesting point, Ruth, because what you have amongst Democrats in the last 2 days, I have to admit, because I don't know what the future should look like, is a debate by members of a party who are part of a big tent, some of whom think Joe Biden should go, he should step aside, he should be replaced by someone else, some of whom think he should stay. All of which tells me that the Democrats are not a cult at the moment. They're a bunch of different people with differing views who, at the moment, would like the preservation of democracy and they would like that forum to be in the defeat of Donald Trump. Republicans are in a different place. What Trump says is right and is not to be questioned.
Yeah, one of the reasons that far-right messaging is so effective is that they have unified messaging. And Trump, ever since his first impeachment, has, put the vice on the party so that people who it's not just voting, in ways he doesn't like, it's even saying anything. Remember when Senator Ted Cruz was hauled on Tucker Carlson's show a long time ago because he made the mistake of calling January 6th a terrorist operation, and he was publicly humiliated, and you could see the fear in his eyes because he's a senator, but he had no power in that moment because he had violated the unified propaganda talking points. And so that's the advantage that they have had. Now, you could say that the Democrats having this public questioning is a sign of health in the party. The only thing is, I'm just very skeptical because from where I sit, I study authoritarians who are superb performers. They're professional liars. And what we saw was somebody who lied with great vigor and great energy. And so he's being proclaimed the winner of the debate. And that's not a sign of a healthy democracy. That's a sign of a environment where the kind of sensationalist values have taken hold over the meaning of politics. So the form and the style matters, the content no longer matters. So Biden telling the truth in a feeble way made him the loser. Trump telling lies in a vigorous way made him the winner. That's not right.
And let's see how this all pans out. We only have one poll right now. It was a Morning Consult poll that was released after the race. Although, I think if I were polled right now, I would say to somebody, I need a few days to digest, to read, to think. We need to see what, we saw what Joe Biden had to say, Senator, on Friday in response, in which he said, I'm not the man I used to be in a lot of ways. But the Morning Consult poll was interesting in that it shows the race largely unchanged by the debate. 45% of registered voters say they support Joe Biden. 44% say they support Trump, which is within the margin of error. The caveat that there's normally limitations to polling that take place sort of right after an event. What do you think the right answer is? The Democrats and people who don't want Donald Trump to be the president would just like to know what the road forward looks like. And I think they'd like to know that someone's thinking about it, probably Joe Biden and those around him. What's your sense of what the future should look like? Should Joe Biden be staying in this race, or should there be some consideration by Joe Biden about a different option?
Look, Ali, I know this. I've known Joe Biden for 45 years now, plus. And I know that they have looked at the game films. I know that they have discussed the performance the other night. But I also know this. At his core, and everybody in the world that has ever watched Joe Biden knows this, that at his core, Joe Biden makes decisions not based on personal gain the way that Donald Trump does. He makes decisions based on what he believes to be in the best interest of the country. And that's what he's going to do. And the path forward is to continue to show the American people what you have done, your deliberation, your experience, your team, your judgment. Those are the kind of things that are going to be very, very important. And, I think it's also important to remember, and the Morning Consult poll was very important, I think, because it was a snapshot immediately after the debate. What I'm likely to see now is because of the media coverage, as opposed to the actual debate itself, the media coverage, it maybe cause a little slip in those polls. But I think that can be overcome very easily. One of the things, remember this. Remember the Access Hollywood tape? Remember the calls among Republicans for Donald Trump to drop out of the race.
Yep.
Well, those kind of things are gone now. January 6th, Republicans thought that they had rid their party of Donald Trump. That lasted about 48 hours. And so this is a healthy debate. And at the same time, what's going to happen? They're going to make a decision in the best interest of the country. We're going to go forward on the issues that have made this a very successful presidency, and will continue to make it a successful presidency in the 4 years to come.
Thank you to both of you. I appreciate this analysis. This is a remarkably important issue, and your input is really valuable to those out there who are trying to process this. Doug Jones is a former United States Senator from Alabama. He's a former United States Attorney and the author of the book Bending Toward Justice. Ruth Ben-Ghiat is a professor of history at New York University and the author of the Lucid newsletter and the book Strong Men, From Mussolini to the Present. On Friday, the Supreme Court's conservative supermajority dealt a serious blow to democracy by overturning the 40-year-old legal precedent known as the Chevron doctrine in what many court watchers are calling a judicial power grab. This longstanding principle required courts to defer to federal agencies' own interpretation of laws that they administer in the case of ambiguities or questions about enforcement of laws. Now, this is just sensible. It's how functioning governments work. Congress or a legislature cannot possibly anticipate every question that might arise about any given law that's passed. So it typically, and again, it's not just in America, it's all over the world in working democracies. The legislature typically delegates that sort of authority and enforcement to experts at the federal agencies who actually administer the law. For example, the scientists at the Environmental Protection Agency, or the public health officials at the CDC, specialists in their respective fields who can interpret complex regulatory matters. Now, Friday's landmark ruling shifts that final say on ambiguity in federal laws from these experts to unelected judges at the federal level, potentially including those on the conservative supermajority of the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, the ruling, which was split along ideological lines 6-3, is a major win for the conservative push to weaken federal agencies. It's often termed the war on the administrative state. This effort seeks to dismantle the regulatory framework that oversees crucial aspects of your life and of business, from education to the environment to food safety to health care. This effort by conservatives is detrimental to democracy because regulatory oversight by specialized agencies serves as a critical defense against predatory practices by companies and industries. It helps stave off the corrupting influence that money and privilege have in American politics. While you may have limited interaction with Congress and with your elected officials, the decisions made by these government agencies shape many aspects of your life, your health, and your money. Friday's ruling effectively undermines both the legislative and the executive branches of government by prioritizing judicial judgments over agency expertise. And in doing so, it diminishes Congress's ability to legislate effectively by delegating to these special agencies. The winners of this ruling, make no mistake about it, are likely to be large corporations. The ruling also provides a significant boost to Project 2025, the conservative blueprint for the first 180 days of a potential second Trump term, which takes direct aim at the so-called administrative state several times in its 920 pages. Project 2025 aims to dismantle democratic institutions by purging the executive branch of career civil servants and replacing them with conservative ideologues whose loyalties lie with the president, presumably a future President Trump. Quote, the administrative state is often at odds with conservative thought, even under conservative leadership. Unless conservatives take a firm hand to the bureaucracy and marshal its power, nothing will stop the bureaucracy's anti-free market leftist march. There are many tools to bring the administrative state to heel, and in the process defang and defund the woke culture warriors who have infiltrated every last institution in America. Our goal is to assemble an army of trained and prepared conservatives to go to work on day one to deconstruct the administrative state, end quote. That's why you got to read Project 2025. It's full of gems like this. Now, thanks to the Supreme Court on Friday morning, while everybody was talking about the debate, Project 2025's agenda has a significant head start, positioning conservatives to pursue their plan of fundamentally restructuring governance and diminishing the role of federal agencies. And the losers in this shift are the millions of ordinary Americans who benefit from regulatory protections. They all hear that regulation is bad, but regulation is a thing that makes sure that the meat in the restaurant's fridge is kept at a particular temperature. Regulation is a thing that makes sure there isn't lead in the paint that is in your house. So when we come back, I'm going to be joined by two very smart lawyers to help us unpack all of this, one of whom is calling this the biggest Supreme Court power grab since 1803. Ellie, I just want to put this in context because I was a little upset on Friday morning that despite everybody talking about the debate, certainly not an unimportant matter, this ruling, this one of the most important rulings that to come down from the Supreme Court, Monday's maybe more important about immunity, but I don't know if that's true. A government works because legislators delegate authority to a civil service that is supposed to be made up of career people, non-politicized people, and experts to execute the laws that a legislature passes. This fundamentally guts that process.
Yeah, this is more important than immunity because it changes the fundamental structure of American government and it takes power directly away from the people and puts it in the hand of unelected judges. We talk about this as Chevron deference. We talk about this as executive agency power, but understand what those legal jargon terms means. The President of the United States, who we all get to vote for, gets to place the heads of these executive agencies whose job, constitutionally speaking, is to enforce laws passed by Congress. This ruling on Friday says that no matter who we elect for president, no matter what agency heads and policies he puts in, no matter what Congress says, that the enforcement power that is given to the president has been taken away and given to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is now the body that the Supreme Court that nobody gets to vote for is now the body that's in charge of enforcing laws passed by Congress. So when Congress says there should be clean water, guess who gets to decide what the word clean means in that context? That is now the Supreme Court,
right,
not the scientists at the EPA. Guess who gets to decide
right.
what water
I want a
means
scientist determining that. Yeah.
And now the
Supreme Court. Yeah, no, this is the point. But Jody, the problem is this is the consequence. This is the consequence of carrying on about the deep state. But it's not even that. That's just a recent development. This really started with Reagan, saying many decades ago that the era of big government is over. It's just been an attack on government. You can argue that there are too many civil servants. You can argue that there are some regulations that shouldn't be there that are inefficient. But we've gotten carried away with this whole thing, and we've just simply decided that the administrative state, the regulatory state, is a bad thing. Without the regulatory state, I'd have diarrhea every day because I'd be eating spoiled milk. I'd be sick from paint that had lead in it. My life would be a disaster if somebody didn't actually administer the rules, and I don't need Congress doing that.
So let me put this in context, right? As you're saying, Congress basically tells the administrative agencies, think about who they are, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Food and Drug Administration, right? It says to them, do these jobs for us, right? Protect investors from fraud. Make sure that there's clean air and clean water. Make sure that the drug and food supply is safe, right? And then it says to the agencies, you figure out on a day-to-day basis how to accomplish those goals, how to implement these statutes, and how to enforce them against violators. This decision, which overturns, as you say, the Chevron principle, is really about shifting the benefit of the doubt. It used to be, for 40 years now, that the benefit of the doubt goes to the agency. Whenever Congress wasn't perfectly clear and there's some ambiguity or gap in the law, the agency gets the first kick at the can to decide, well, what would Congress have wanted here and what's the best way to interpret it? What the Supreme Court has done is throw away decades of precedent and say, oh, no, no benefit of the doubt to the expert agency. Rather, we, the court, will decide in every instance what every word in the statute means. And they can do that in a way that cuts back on regulation and makes it harder for the agency to act. And one more thing I'd add. This case is not alone. There are a series of cases that the Supreme Court has been deciding, that the court's been deciding at every stage of the regulatory process, adopting rules, implementing those rules, and then enforcing them and assessing penalties. At every single stage, the court has cut back on the ability of the agencies to do that. So you have to look at the set of cases this term, all of which limit agency power, make it harder to regulate, and in a way it disrespects both the Congress and the executive branch, amassing power for the court itself.
And then you have to ask why they're doing that, right?
Go ahead. Yeah.
You have to ask why they're doing it, right? Because it's not like the Supreme Court is stupid. They know what kind of world they're trying to have, right? And so with this ruling on Friday, the Supreme Court has set itself up to not only have this massive power grab, right? It also can use it only at its own discretion, which means if there is a regulation that the Supreme Court likes, that the conservatives on the Supreme Court likes, that regulation will be upheld. If there's a regulation that the conservatives on the Supreme Court don't like, that regulation will be thrown out. So there's no power for the people to choose for themselves what laws that we want to live under, because the Supreme Court has taken all that power to itself. And at a very granular level, like I know that a lot of Twitter lawyer type people are like, ooh, well, it just gives Congress more power. No. Do you want to have a conversation with me about what Marjorie Taylor Greene thinks and knows about how many particulates of lead are allowed to be in the water before it hurts a child's developmental process? Do you think that she can even understand the words that just came out of my mouth, much less write a piece of legislation that solves that issue? Like, as much as I like voting for Congress, let's not pretend like Congress is always on top of the ball of all of these situations. That's why we give the experts, the scientists, the regulators, the opportunity to fill out the gaps in congressional legislation.
Here's what I'd add, Alec, to
Jody.
Let me
go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to add to this. What this does is it throws the state of affairs into chaos. So the Supreme Court does this a lot, right? It upsets precedent. It sort of throws out decades and decades of established law and says, well, guess what? Things are changing. And what this case means is that now in all the lower federal courts, you got 850 federal judges in the country. They're going to now say, oh, we no longer defer to the expert agencies. In every case, we'll open up our dictionaries and we'll be looking at our textualist arguments to determine what these very technical statutory terms mean. And so it will mean you've got an invitation to litigate, to challenge what agencies do every day on a more regular basis. It'll invite lots of litigation, lots of disruption. And my point is always, that's not just bad for the American public that is protected by these laws and needs them implemented. It's bad for business because business relies on steady, stable state. It needs clear regulation, clear and steady regulation from agencies in order to do business. So I think the chaos that the court is sowing is really bad for the economy. It's bad for society. It's bad for business. And they seem to have a kind of total lack of humility. You know, their view is we can decide everything. We don't need to defer very much to these expert agencies. We don't need them very much. And we're going to be able to sort all this out. Supreme Court only decides about 80 cases a year. And that means guess who's going to be deciding what the technical terms are? A bunch of lower court, federal district court judges, an increasingly conservative judiciary.
Exactly.
It's a very And so this does benefit, I would project, on average, it benefits those who oppose regulation, those who want to jam up the agency process, those who think that these are, bureaucrats who overreach. That's the sort of stuff you hear all the time. Instead of a really more balanced picture, which is that the people who work in these agencies get up every day and try to make sure your food and drug supply is safe and planes land and trains don't get derailed. You know what I mean? They're doing the business, the work of the American people. We take all this for granted, when we drink clean water. And you got to understand that there's a basic amount of federal regulations that's necessary for a modern society and economy to operate.
That's right. That is exactly right. I could talk to you guys about this for hours. I'm so grateful to you both. Thank you very much, and I apologize for discussing diarrhea this morning. Jody Freeman is a professor at the Harvard Law School. She's a founder and director of Harvard's Environmental and Energy Law Program. Elie Mystal is a columnist and justice correspondent from The Nation and author of the book Allow Me to Retort: A Black Guy's Guide to the Constitution. Joining me now is Michael Cohen. He's a former personal attorney to Donald Trump. He's the author of the books Revenge: How Donald Trump Weaponized the Department of Justice Against His Critics, and Disloyal, a memoir. Michael is also host of the podcast Mea Culpa with Michael Cohen and Political Beatdown. And I was on with Michael. Michael, you were the first person I had a full, long, 1-hour conversation with on Friday morning after the debate. And it was a frank and amazing conversation, and I'd like to replicate some of it for our viewers with a little less swearing. But you made this point very clearly. You said all the things I just said. Yeah, it was a disappointing debate. There's no question. But Donald Trump said one thing that was true in that debate. He said one thing that was not a lie in that debate, and I think it was when he said what his name was. This has got to be focused on who Donald Trump is and the threat that he poses to this country.
Yeah, look, I said to you, and I'll say it to your audience as well. In Donald's world of lies and deceit, it's the way I saw the debate. Joe Biden is a beacon of truth. Now, the following day in North Carolina, you heard Joe Biden give this the energy that we were hoping that we were going to see during the debate. And he came out and he said, I'm not a young man. And the crowd went wild because it's true, chanting Joe, Joe, Joe. And he says, I don't walk the way I used to. I don't speak the way that I used to. And I don't debate the way that I used to. And again, the crowd went wild for it. You know, look, there's such a contrast between these two individuals. You know, I also want to tell you, Ali, this morning I was talking to a friend of mine, and we were talking about the debate and Joe Biden looking very tired, which is what he looked. Something that I think the American people really need to remember here is that while Trump, during the day of the debate, was contemplating on what he was going to eat for breakfast or, you know, which golf course he wanted to play golf at that day, Joe Biden was still running the country and he was tired. And this thing, started at 9 p.m. at night. And so, yeah, I get it. He's 80, I get it. He was tired. Probably they should have done it earlier, right? But 9 o'clock was late, or maybe they should have given him some downtime because right now, as you know, the world is a little chaotic and he is still the CEO of the United States of America. On top of that, we're also, as the citizens that will be electing who the next president is, think about this as, would you get rid of your stock because you had a bad quarter with the CEO? Would you ask the CEO to step down because you have a bad quarter or half year, 2 quarters, or even a full year? And I think the answer to that is no. So this sort of overexuberance by the populace, especially Democrats, automatically asking for Joe Biden to step down. I think you have to look at what he has accomplished in the 3.5 years that he's been president and say, if he is the president and he would be running against Donald Trump, who's clearly the right choice to take us from 2024 to 2028? And that's an easy answer. It's Biden-Harris.
You had said, and maybe I'll just make this offer out there right now, that in preparation for the next debate, they had some very good people, Bob Bauer, Ron Klain, helping the president prepare. You offered your services when you and I were talking the other day, and I think I should put it out there because when I mentioned that to a few people, they said, it's not a bad idea. Maybe they should have Michael Cohen in there because you felt that there were, and Joe Biden doesn't talk like you do, but you felt that there were some opportunities for Joe Biden not simply to prove that he's a good president or he's been a good president or that he's got the public interest in mind, but to remind people exactly of who Donald Trump is. What would you suggest? Putting aside the energy and the tiredness stuff, what would you suggest Joe Biden does in the next debate to remind people and more importantly, put Donald Trump, on the defensive?
Yeah, so from the very first question, what I would have done is I would have come at Donald Trump with facts, something, of course, Donald Trump knows nothing about. There was no, there wasn't even a minutia of facts in anything that Trump says. He spews all sorts of nonsense. And what you need to do is constantly remind the viewer that what Donald Trump is saying is a lie, that it is inaccurate, that it only exists between his ears in that space called Trump land and his MAGA supporters. It's just not true. And you need to, of course, from the very, very first question, you wanted to come out and you want to remind exactly the way you and so many other moderators or, journalists describe Donald Trump, the twice impeached. I am running against a twice impeached, four-time indicted criminal felon on 34 counts of fraud who's bankrupted his company 7 times. It's also not just what you say, it's also how you say it. There's a specific way that you have to say things to Donald Trump in order to get under his skin. And that's what Joe Biden needed to do. In this debate, he allowed Donald to get very comfortable. In fact, they didn't talk about the 34 criminal convictions until minute 45 of the 90-minute debate. I would have, right out of the rip, I would have come straight out and I would have started to talk about his criminal convictions. I would have talked about all of the things that Donald, 35,000 lies that this man, my opponent, has told you, the American people, from COVID to Roe v. Wade to, climate change and everything in between. This man has lied to you, the American public, 35,000 times. You will not hear a single thing of truth emanating from this man's hole underneath his nose. You will not hear a single truth during this entire debate. And I want you to remember that when he's answering these questions. You come out and you swing hard.
Michael, thank you for joining us this morning. We appreciate it. Michael Cohen is a former personal attorney to Donald Trump. He's the author of Revenge, How Donald Trump Weaponized the Department of Justice Against His Critics, and Disloyal, a memoir. He's the host of the Mea Culpa podcast with Michael Cohen. I want to take you all the way back to May of 1788. A new nation was coming together. The Constitution had not yet been fully ratified, and a series of essays was being published in New York newspapers to rally support for its ratification, all signed with the pen name Publius. The essay published on May 28th, in fact written like most of the Federalist Papers by Alexander Hamilton, was titled The Judicial Department. It's a masterful argument for our third branch of government, the judiciary, which Hamilton referred to as the least dangerous branch to the political rights enumerated in the Constitution because, quote, it will be the least in a capacity to annoy or injure them. The judiciary has no influence over either the sword or the purse, no direction either of the strength or of the wealth of the society, and can take no active resolution whatever. It may truly be said to have neither force nor will, but merely judgment, end quote. Merely judgment. That's how Hamilton tried to thread the needle on judicial independence. He argued that Supreme Court justices should be unelected and serve lifetime appointments so that they could operate irrespective of politics. That was the check against Congress and the executive branch. The balance against unelected lifetime judges would be their inability to actually enforce their own decisions. Neither sword nor purse, neither force nor will. The idea was the justices make the rulings, but it's up to the other branches of government, the president and Congress, to actually enforce them. The power of the Supreme Court lies in a cooperative government and a trusting public. What this means is that we as a society must believe the court is an independent arbiter of constitutional questions. Congress and the president and the citizenry that elects them must believe that the court's decisions are worthy of being followed and enforced. In that sense, the court is a bit like Tinkerbell. If we stop believing in it, in its power, its legitimacy vanishes. And the Supreme Court legitimacy right now is vanishing before our eyes. In a Gallup poll conducted before the Supreme Court's current term, 49% of Americans said they had a great deal or a fair amount of trust in the judicial branch of the government. Since 1972, that number has hovered around the 60s. It hit a low of 47% in 2022. Today, the Supreme Court faces dual legitimacy crises. There's a credibility crisis caused by the actions of some of the justices, from Justice Thomas's undisclosed financial relationships to Justice Alito's secret recordings and upside-down flag, both of which have cast doubt on their political independence. And then there's the court's recent track record of tearing down decades-old precedent with deeply unpopular decisions like the overturning of Roe v. Wade, gutting the Voting Rights Act, and dismantling affirmative action. And then there is tomorrow. We will learn whether this court will say that Donald Trump was able to freely and openly commit crimes without consequence. We already have an electorate that has lost faith in Congress. The current Congress is on track to be one of the least productive in American history. If Donald Trump wins back the presidency in the fall, he literally has a 900-plus page playbook full of detailed plans to dismantle the civil service apparatus of the government, consolidate power in the executive branch, and weaponize the Justice Department. And the Supreme Court, the last branch, the least dangerous, is rolling back long-held personal rights. They're accepting lavish gifts from billionaire political players, refusing to even discuss with congressional leaders ethics or oversight. And at best, at the moment, seemingly helping Donald Trump delay his remaining criminal trials until after the election. And at worst, well, we'll see in the next 24 hours. But here's the problem. When people stop believing in the systems that keep democracy running, those systems will cease to function. This week, the Supreme Court faced a simple question. Do pregnant women in Idaho facing serious health complications deserve emergency stabilizing care? Instead of providing an answer, the court's majority punted the case back to the district court, ruling that it had reached the bench prematurely. Now, the dismissal leaves in effect the district court's injunction against Idaho's near-total abortion ban, temporarily allowing pregnant women in the state to access emergency care. By upholding the injunction, the court appeared to address the issue, permitting Idaho doctors to perform emergency abortions. In reality, the court did nothing to address the merits of a case having an impact on more than 24 states with similar draconian bans. The decision to dismiss the case leaves the national abortion landscape unsettled as medical professionals across the country struggle to make sense of which pregnancy complications they can legally treat under the narrow medical exceptions provided in their state's abortion bans. At the heart of the case is whether EMTALA, a federal law requiring hospitals to provide emergency care, preempts Idaho's near-total abortion ban. Before the district court's injunction, pregnant women facing dangerous health conditions like preeclampsia or ectopic pregnancies were being airlifted to other states instead of receiving immediate treatment in Idaho. Dr. James P. Souza, a chief physician at an Idaho hospital, describes how Idaho's abortion ban forces doctors to confront a series of agonizing questions when treating patients. Quote, is she sick enough? Is she bleeding enough? Is she septic enough for me to do this abortion and not risk going to jail and losing my license? When the guessing game gets too uncomfortable, we transfer the patients out at a very high cost to another state where the doctors are allowed to practice medicine, end quote. This is the harsh reality we're living under post-Dobbs. On the surface, the Supreme Court's decision to uphold the injunction allowing emergency abortions seems like a major win for abortion rights. In reality, critics believe that the court is avoiding a ruling because they recognize that an unpopular decision could influence the upcoming election, much like Dobbs did in the lead-up to the 2022 midterms. Much like the Mifepristone case, the court likely punted this case back to a district court to stretch out the litigation, allowing it to continue for another year or two. Critics believe that Justices Barrett, Kavanaugh, and Roberts, often referred to as the middle three, are banking on a potential Trump win that could lead to reinterpretations of the EMTALA statute. Meanwhile, the court's liberal justices, Kagan and Sotomayor, likely agreed to dismiss the case in exchange for maintaining Idaho's injunction. In a scathing dissent, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson calls out her colleagues, accusing them of delaying a decision as an act of, quote, political chicanery before the election, end quote. Reading her dissent from the bench, which is a move typically reserved for when justices feel strongly about an issue, Jackson goes on to accuse the majority of endangering lives, stating, quote, will this court just have a do-over, rehearing and rehashing the same arguments we're considering now, just at a comparatively more convenient point in time? Or maybe we will keep punting on this issue altogether, facilitating the suffering of people in need of urgent medical treatment. The court's dismissal comes on the heels of a recent Johns Hopkins study showing a spike in infant deaths in Texas. Study is the latest research showing higher infant mortality rates in states with draconian abortion restrictions. Between March and December of 2022, Texas witnessed a 13% increase in infant deaths following the passing of its near-total abortion ban. Birth defects increased by 23%. And that's compared to a 3% decrease in the rest of the United States. For a movement that brands itself pro-life, the so-called pro-life movement is noticeably silent on these actual deaths. Meanwhile, the conservative Fifth Circuit earlier this year ruled that EMTALA did not preempt Texas's strict abortion ban. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court will eventually have to make a decision on this question. And while patients in Idaho are, at least for now, protected by the injunction, millions of others now face deep uncertainty unleashed by the Supreme Court's decision to delay. I'm joined by Michelle Goodwin, a professor of constitutional law and global health policy at Georgetown Law. She's the award-winning author of Policing the Womb, Invisible Women and the Criminalization of Motherhood. Michelle, there's some really important legal stuff here, but I actually want to skip to the statistical things that I mentioned in the introduction, the increase in birth defects and the increase in infant deaths as a result of the passing of the law banning abortion without exception, or generally without exception, in Texas. This is a real outcome. This is a real outcome of what happens when you ban abortion. You have often pointed out that maternal mortality rates and infant mortality rates in America are far higher than they should be in a fully developed nation in the richest country in the world. And we are seeing the actual statistical results of the passage of these laws since the fall of Roe.
Right. So it's not just we are the most dangerous place in all of the industrialized world to be pregnant or for infants to be born. We rank 55th in the world in terms of maternal mortality. Maternal morbidity is also something that's important to pay attention to, meaning that a woman might survive after the pregnancy, but for the rest of her life be in a chronic condition. And we knew this even before the Dobbs decision, as Texas had begun work to shut down abortion clinics. In the wake of all of that, what we saw, more women becoming pregnant, more maternal mortality in that state. We know that this exists because many of the places that provided abortion care were places that provided prenatal care, postnatal care, contraceptive access, all of those things. And when those clinics closed, that meant that fundamental health care for women in those regions was then suddenly gone. And we're a country that does not have universal health care, which means that for poor women, working class women, they really relied on those health care clinics. Keep in mind that in the states that have now shuttered abortion clinics, have imposed these abortion bans, they've not set up new hospitals. They've not set up new clinics. They have left these women to suffer without any access to more health care.
In a couple of minutes, I'm going to be talking to Jeff Rosen, the president and CEO of the National Constitution Center, who always reminds me when there's a Supreme Court opinion to read concurrences and dissenting opinions. Justice Amy Coney Barrett's concurrence introduced a new and somewhat alarming theory concerning EMTALA. Can you give me a sense of her argument, what the strategy might be in advancing her theory?
Well, the strategy that we see between the Mifepristone case and as well as the EMTALA case have been these concerns about people who have religious views, and these religious views that may end up allowing them to circumvent what would be federal protections and protections that would keep individuals alive. One thing that I want to make sure that we surface before we go is that the point of EMTALA was to protect individuals who were poor or in an emergency situation where we're not at home and we need care. Mind that this was the same kind of theory that we needed during the civil rights movement when African Americans literally died on the steps of hospitals not being cared for. What EMTALA does is it protects not only pregnant women, it protects anybody who needs emergency health care. We have seen what it's like in this country when people of color have been turned away, when poor people have been turned away, when people who have immigrant status have been turned away. And that's part of the danger in this. All Americans could be deeply concerned with the Supreme Court trying to slice and dice within this space because those protections protected us all. And once you begin cutting away, who will be the next group of people that will not be able to get service?
Right, and we actually have real stories about doctors who are saying, you're not sick enough, you're not bleeding enough, you're not septic enough.
That's right.
I'm not going to risk my license on this. Michelle, good to see you as always. Thank you. Michelle Goodwin is a professor of constitutional law and global health policy at Georgetown Law. She's the host of the On the Issues podcast with Michelle Goodwin, author of a book, Policing the Womb, Invisible Women and the Criminalization of Motherhood. Tomorrow is likely to be a remarkably important day, and our viewers need to understand the consequences. So, Professor Tribe, let me start with you. Many Supreme Court watchers pretty much predicted that the justices would wait until in fact, Judge Luttig predicted the same thing. They would wait probably until the very last day of this term to issue its opinion on Trump's immunity claim. But it didn't have to be this way. What's your sense of the delay? What do you expect to happen, and what consequence do you expect to follow, regardless of what the Supreme Court's opinion may be?
Well, thanks for having me on, Ali. It's quite clear that the court's delay was deliberate. They could have resolved the case by simply letting the extraordinarily comprehensive opinion of the D.C. Circuit stay unaffected. They could have agreed to leapfrog that case the way they do in another set of circumstances. They could have decided this case as far back as last December. The argument was over 60 days ago. It was on April 25th. They have slow walked it. There's no reason to, because the claim that any person in this country, president or not, has absolute immunity when he tries to overturn an election and prevent the transition of power is absurd. I can't imagine that the Supreme Court will take that position. Rather, what it is likely to do is muddy the waters by pointing out that just last week in the Fisher case, it put limits on the reach of the statute involving obstructing an official proceeding, which is one of the criminal statutes that the special counsel has invoked in his election interference indictments. It's not the only one. There are also statutes about defrauding the United States and stealing people's votes. But the obstruction statute, as the majority opinion by Chief Justice Roberts pointed out, is now not quite as broad-reaching as the language would suggest. Justice Barrett, in her brilliant dissenting opinion last Friday, said that the court had to do textual flips over and over again, acrobatics, in order to avoid reading the word otherwise, where it says otherwise obstructing a proceeding, to mean not otherwise, but by the same means. Now, that's getting technical, but the bottom line is that there will be an open question after whatever the court decides tomorrow on the immunity issue. One open question that I think has been clear to the court ever since the day it heard argument in this case, which was the day after it heard argument in an important other case, The open question is whether the manipulation of electoral ballots and the interference with those ballots and the conspiracy to forge and alter electoral certificates is sufficiently like the evidence tampering that the court says is the heart of the obstruction statute. Now, analogies are always difficult, and I can imagine the DC Circuit or Judge Chutkan on remand struggling with that question of resemblance, whereas if Justice Barrett's position had prevailed and she was joined by Justices Sotomayor and Kagan, it would be an open and shut case that this did involve obstruction of an official proceeding. The other open question is going to be whether whatever immunity the court finds for former presidents, and there might be immunity for some core exercise of presidential power like the pardon power, whatever immunity it finds is not going to cover 99% of what the president is charged with having done. And the task of separating the wheat from the chaff, identifying which things the president is charged with having done, avoid whatever immunity the court finds exists, that task could lead to further proceedings in the lower courts, further clarifying the virtual impossibility of trying the case to verdict before the election. But the silver lining, and I'll try to keep this very short, the silver lining is that if there is a hearing in the lower court, that doesn't have to be a hearing that is held off for over 80 days, the way Judge Chutkan said the trial would have to be held off even if she's given a green light. That hearing could occur next week. And at that hearing, which could continue through the election season, the evidence about what the president is charged with having done in the plot to overturn the election will be laid before the American people, who have undoubtedly either not seen or have forgotten the evidence gathered by the January 6th committee. And that would be the upside of a rather complicated ruling.
So this is good, because now we're getting into some meat here, and Judge Luttig, who alerted me, by the way, to your article on this. Thank you, Judge, for doing that. This is the work of judges and lawyers to try and figure out. So Matthew Seligman, who co-authored the brief that Professor Tribe signed on to, Judge Luttig, has written in it, no one disputes. Wrote an opinion piece for MSNBC in which he said, no one disputes that the electoral count is an official proceeding, and no one could deny that electoral certificates are, quote, records, documents, objects, or other things used, end quote, in the electoral count. So the only question is whether the defendant impaired the availability or integrity of the electoral certificates for use in the electoral count. If the defendant we're talking about is Donald Trump, and Professor Tribe is correct that this hearing on this matter could go forward, what effect would that have on the totality of Donald Trump being held responsible for trying to overturn an election?
Ali, you're exactly correct, and as is Professor Tribe. On the larger point, though, the former president has corrupted America's democracy, constitution, and the rule of law, and now, with the Supreme Court's almost interminable delay of the immunity decision, he's gotten away with it. America's democracy and the rule of law are the heart and soul of the nation. America's been the beacon of freedom and liberty to the world for almost 250 years now because of its democracy and the rule of law. And through his defiance of that democracy and rule of law, Donald Trump has, I've said previously, unsouled the nation. The only redemption for this unsouling of America at this point is that Donald Trump at least be held accountable for what he has done. But the Supreme Court, as you and Professor Tribe are saying, has already effectively given him what he asked for. absolute immunity for his grave offenses. At this point, I have to doubt whether Donald Trump will ever be tried for his criminal offenses against the United States and the Constitution. Now, tomorrow we'll know whether the Supreme Court even permits his trial for those offenses. But if it does, the court has already made a trial of the former president practically impossible. At best, Jack Smith will have to decide whether to ask for the trial to begin 1 month before the 2024 election. It would be impossible both to begin and end Donald Trump's trial before the November election. No prosecutor would want to straddle the election with the first trial of an American president in history, who himself is a candidate for the presidency in that election. The politics of the moment will all but demand that Jack Smith forego trial before the election and until after the election. But I would urge Jack Smith, in the strongest possible terms today, not to yield to that cynical partisan politics and to bring this case on for trial even in September or October.
Wow.
In the name of and for the sake of American democracy, the Constitution, and the rule of law.
Judge, is there any chance that if Jack Smith hears this and takes your guidance on that Tanya Chutkan would allow that to happen?
Yes, there's every chance in the world that Judge Chutkan would allow that to happen, Ali.
Professor Tribe, what's your sense of a trial that does that? Because for people like us who want to see accountability and for whom justice is paramount, it's a wild inconvenience to have a trial in the middle of an election, but it might feel like a little more justice. What's your sense of having a trial that possibly straddles an election of the first president to ever face criminal election interference charges?
To put it mildly, it's not ideal. But I firmly agree with Judge Luttig, and I've said this myself publicly. Jack Smith should proceed to trial just as soon as the United States Supreme Court and Tanya Chutkan permit him to do so. The policy of the Justice Department not to initiate criminal investigations within 2 months of an election has no role here. First, because this is not a matter of initiating an investigation, it's a matter of holding a trial that in fact was originally scheduled to be held back in March and that has been delayed for no good reason. Second, this is not a standard situation in which convenience should make the slightest difference. As Judge Luttig says, American democracy and the rule of law and the survival of our constitutional republic are all on the line. This is a moment of existential significance. Of course, I would urge Jack Smith to proceed to trial absolutely as soon as he can, not to scratch his head and wonder whether it looks good or not, to have a trial straddling an election in which the criminal defendant, already convicted on 34 felonies, happens also to be a candidate for president. To allow him to use his candidacy as a get-out-of-jail-free card, not only by assuring everyone that if he wins, he will find an attorney general who dismisses this case, but also by arranging it so that, oh gosh, it's inconvenient to hold a trial now, I'm in the middle of campaigning, would be a travesty. It would be the most outrageous example of justice delayed being justice denied. And it is not just justice for one individual, it's justice for the American people.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.